Hello friends, this is Nick from NLB Solutions, and today I'm going to show you how you can install Windows Server 2012 and later promote it to the first domain controller in your environment. We are going to start with a clean installation of Windows Server 2012. It will be plain simple, it will be really fast, so hopefully you'll be able to gather an overview how this is done. In the meantime, while we are installing the server, we are going to speak about some considerations when you want this server to be a domain controller. We are going to speak about the server version that we are going to install, about the storage requirements, if we want our server to be installed with a GUI interface or without one, the server core version. After the installation is done, we are going to configure our local server settings like static IP address. We are going to rename the server with a suitable name that fits our naming convention, and another thing that we are going to look at is configure remote access and time zone options. After we are finished with configuring the local settings on the server, we are going to proceed with adding the Active Directory Domain Services role alongside with DNS server role. Later we are going to promote our server to the first domain controller in our environment. I'm going to show you how you can create a new forest, how to set the functional levels of the forest and the domain, from where you can set the directory services restore mode, password. We are going to look at the default Active Directory database paths, and we are going to take a quick look at the PowerShell script that is going to configure everything for us. At the end of the video, we are going to make a quick overview of the Active Directory domain services and DNS within the server manager. So let's begin. So first I'm going to start with installing my server 2012 R2. Note that you can start the installation from a bootable DVD disk that you have and for example bootable USB that you pre-configured before that. In this case I'm going to mount the ISO file directly into my virtual machine, and I'm going to install from the ISO file. First you will be asked for your language, so you can select the language that you prefer and click next. The second option will ask you if you want to repair the computer or if you want to install now. I'm going to click install now. And now the setup is going to load the needed drivers that will detect my hardware. In the first window you will be able to see and you will be able to choose from different Windows images that you have within your ISO or your bootable USB. So in my case I'm using the Windows 2012 R2 evaluation copy, which contains two images of standard data center edition, and of course you can see that they are split between core version and GUI version. Don't forget that now with 2012 we can switch between GUI and core version whenever we want to. So for example, if you want to, and you know that it's more easy to configure a server with a GUI, and if for example that server is not going to be on a secure location, you can configure the role on your server. After that, remove the GUI and be more confident when you are presenting the server in the non-secure location. So in this situation I'm going to choose the standard edition with the GUI version and click next. I'm going to accept the license terms and click next. I'm going to choose the option to install Windows, and again this time I have a blank disk that I've attached to my virtual machine. I've used the standard default 60 gigabytes, but you need to consider, depending on your environment, how much space would you need, because after all we are going to install some updates on the server, and we are going to store some additional information on that server. For example, the Active Directory database can grow in the future with more users, more objects in it. Another thing to consider is the storage that you are going to install your server on. Usually we need to, and I recommend using a redundant storage. So for example, if one of your disks fails, your whole server will not fail with it, and you can change the disk later and the server will be up and running without noticing anything. In this situation, I'm going to use the only disk that I've presented. I'm going to click next. And now it's going to copy the Windows files and it's going to start my installation. I'm going to pause the video here and we can continue with our next steps when this is finished. So okay, so it's done installing the operating system, and it's going to finish up now, and it's going to ask me to restart my machine. Okay, I'm going to restart now. So it's getting all the devices ready to use. Now that it's going to restart a couple of times. So it's going to ask me to create the built-in administrator account for the server, which I'm going to do now. And click finish. So here I specified a password that it's not meeting the complexity requirements. Basically the complexity requirements should contain an uppercase, lowercase, a number, and a sign, for example exclamation mark. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, let's click finish, and it's going to finalize the settings for me. Okay, so my Windows Server 2012 R2 is done now. You need to press Ctrl Alt and Delete to continue, and log in with the built-in administrator account. Okay, so my server is fully installed now. At this time I'm going to select No for the network configurations, which I want to do manually. and it's going to load the new server manager dashboard, which if you worked with 2008 and R2 is much different. Now we have the option to choose to configure settings on our local server and configure other servers remotely if we want to do that. So let's start configuring our server for and configuring that server before we promote that to a domain controller. First, what I usually do is I go ahead and change the IP address from DHCP assigned one to a static one. Usually in my test environment I use the IP address which was done by the DHCP, and if you want, you can if you don't have a DHCP server on your network, don't worry about it. You can assign a static IP address, because your domain controller needs to run with a static IP address in order for everything to be fully operational and working, because no one wants a domain controller that today is on one IP address and tomorrow is on another IP address. It can make huge issues with connecting to resources over the network. So let's start with that. I use ipconfig to do this. So let's start doing that. You need to go to the control panel and the network connection settings, or it's way easier to use the server manager to configure everything because it's on a single place. So let's start with setting the IP address. Okay. Okay, and the DNS server would be this server after we install the DNS and we promote the server as the first domain controller in the domain. So I will set it to be to listen to itself and to send DNS request to itself. So let's close that. It's going to save the settings. Okay. No, I don't want to. Okay. After that, what you need to do is, if you refresh this page, it will show that we have a static IP address now. After that, what you need to do is you need to change the name of the server. It depends on your naming convention, but in this case I will set it to be NLB DC01. So click OK to that. After changing the name of the server, you will be asked to restart. I'll restart now. I will pause the video again, and after the server is up and running again, I will proceed with the next steps, configuring the local server. So let's restart. So my server is up and running again. I'm going to log into it. It's going to automatically load the server manager console once again. So I'm going to select the local server on the left panel. And now, after I have my computer name as NLBDC01, I have my static IP address assigned, I can proceed with the firewall. Usually from my past experience over the years, I noticed that it's always good to have the guest or public network firewall on and just make some open ports on it if you need for some additional applications that are running, but you need to stick with those. After that, after we promote the server to a domain controller, it's always a good idea to turn off the domain firewall on, so that if you have, because I had some issues over the past with having multiple domain controllers in a single domain, and they were not able to speak correctly. Best thing to do here is to disable the firewall. I will leave the remote management enabled, because it's always a good idea to be able to manage your server remotely. The remote desktop is a thing that is disabled, so you can allow connections, and this is a good idea. It will automatically add a firewall exception for the RDP port on the server. So if you want to connect to your server remotely, that's a thing that you need to enable. So yeah, we can add the administrators, or you can add a specific security group to have access. Usually the domain admins have access with an RDP if it's enabled. The nick theming, I will leave that for now, and we'll continue with the other settings. It's always a good idea before you make the changes to fully update your server, or to have the latest updates installed. If you are using a template, keep that up to date, and it's always a good thing to have all the updates installed that were provided by Microsoft. Another thing to do here is to change the time zone, because it's usually assigning the US Pacific time zone, so you can change that to the time zone of your country, and you can proceed after that by installing the roles that are needed to promote this server as a domain controller, which can be done from the manage option right on the top. From here you can add roles and features, you can remove roles and features. If you go to all servers, you can click from here and again do some additional configurations, like again adding roles and features. You can shut down the server, or other management tools that you can power from here. So this is handy, and I'll just use the add roles and just continue to add the role based or feature based installation. So I will, from here, if you have multiple servers that are connected to your server, you can choose and install remotely roles on them, so you don't need to log on by RDP to every single server. You can do this from here, which is really handy and really fast. So I'm going to use this server, and I'm going to select Active Directory Domain Services. It will ask me to add additional features that can work with this server, so I'm going to add that. It's going to add the DNS role, but just in case, I'm going to add that as well. So I'll click next. Within the features, it's going to select the group policy because it's required, the remote server administration tools. So let's click next. Next once again. Next. Okay, from here it's going to specify what we are going to do now. So you can export the configuration settings and save them somewhere else if you want to deploy that on another server, but I will click install now, and it's going to start the installation. After the installation is done, you need to close the window and continue with the next steps. So I'm going to close that, and you can see right on the top it's going to show an exclamation mark saying that you need to promote this server to a domain controller after installing the domain services. Before, if you were using older versions of Windows Server, we tend to use the dcpromo command, which is not available in 2012 anymore. So they've decided to remove this command and instead just stick with other ways to promote the DC. In this case, as this is a brand new DC on a brand new forest, I'm going to select the option to add a new forest. The other two options are to add an existing domain controller to an existing domain, add a new domain to an existing forest. But in this case, I don't have a forest, I don't have any other domain controllers, so I'm going to specify the root domain name, which will be nlblab.com, and click next. Okay, so after it's done verifying that there is no other domain with which is within the network, we can go to the next step, which is the forest functional level and the domain functional level. It depends on your business, and it depends on what you need to do with this server. In most cases, and what I tend to do is I use a lower forest level, because if I want to join additional servers, additional domain controllers that are not 2012, you need to have or additional domains in the forest, you need to have a lower functional level, so that I use 2008 R2, and I know that this domain is going to have only Windows Server 2012 R2 domain controllers, so I will stick with that. The first domain controller in the forest needs to be a DNS server and a global catalog, and you cannot make it a read-only domain controller, because after all we need a read-write domain controller. The option below for the directory services restore mode password is when, for example, this domain controller it's not able to power up properly, it's not able to load the operating system. So you have another option, which is the directory services restore mode. You can enter that by the advanced boot options, and you can try what is basically doing. It's not launching the domain services, it's not starting the Active Directory services, so that you can use to check the database if there is a problem with the database, or try to restore the full functionality of the database before you continue with powering on the server in full mode. So I'm going to specify a password, and note that this password is very important, so you need to save it somewhere just in case. Okay, we cannot specify a DNS delegation because we don't have any zones at the moment on our DNS, so this is not an option that we can choose at this point of time. It's going to verify for a NetBIOS name, which was used by and it's still used by some legacy applications, and of course Microsoft decided to include that in the 2012 as well. So it's going to pick basically a part of my domain, which is NLBLab, which I'm not going to change, and just click next. Okay, in the next field you will see the paths that you can specify for the Active Directory database and the sysvol. It's always a good idea if you want to be everything to be configured correctly, you can of course choose a different path to store the Active Directory. In this case I'm going to stick with the local paths that are chosen by the Windows server and the promotion, which are within the NTDS folder within Windows and the sysvol folder. Basically the database, the ntds.dit, will be created on this folder, and its log files that are going with that database, and the sysvol folder that contains all my policies and logon, logoff scripts and all the scripts in my domain. So I'm going to click next. It's going to bring me a summary of what I want to do, and if you want to see and if you want to save that configuration, you can choose the view script option, which is basically showing us the PowerShell commands that is going to execute in order for it to fully promote my server to a domain controller. So I'm going to, you can save it somewhere so you can have it in a safe location, and just in case that something happens. And you can review the options that you specified and just click next. On the next step is going to check some prerequisites for the domain controller, and we'll see if the operation is going to be as smooth as possible, and if there are any errors, any mistakes that it's not able to verify, it will warn you here, so you can go over them, you can fix them before you promote the DC. So you want this to be with less errors as possible, because after that you're going to promote this server to a domain controller, and it's going to control and it's going to monitor your environment, and you want it to be as secure as possible and with no flaws within the initial installation. In this case, it's bringing me some warnings that are pretty much usual, so don't worry about them. It's not going to fail if we install that, but yeah, be sure that you don't have any critical errors, anything missing from here. In the top you can see it's saying that all prerequisite checks passed successfully, so you can click install to install Active Directory. So now it's going to start the installation. So after the installation is done, it's going to restart automatically, and it's going to ask you to restart because the Active Directory services was installed or removed. So it's going to restart my server, and after that I will be able to log in with my domain administrator account. So after the restart, I can log into my server once again, and this time it fully configured my domain. So this time, instead of using the local administrator account, I will log into the NLB lab domain, and we are using the same administrator account, which was configured to be the first admin of the domain, and I will use the same password to log in. It will load the server manager, and this time on the left side you will be able to see the additional roles that we've installed, the ADDS role and the DNS role. If you check the system manager overview here, you will be able to see some important information like events that are related to Active Directory, and from here you can monitor if you have any errors or warnings showing about your Active Directory. You can see all of the services that are responsible for your Active Directory and for it to work properly. And on the bottom you can see the best practices analyzer and the performance monitor. So from here you won't be able to configure your ADDS, but if you go to on the right side to tools, you'll be able to see all the modules that were installed for Active Directory, so you can manage and configure everything in your domain. So this is my overview of the installing Windows 2012 R2 server and promoting it to a domain controller, creating a new forest. In a future video I will make some advanced configurations and modifications of the Active Directory. We'll look more deeper into the Active Directory itself and the DNS and DHCP services. So thank you very much for viewing, and see you soon.